Hey guys, and welcome back. For today's project, I'll be sculpting the Deku Mask from The Legend of Zelda, Majora's Mask. I started off by using some armature wire. I twisted that into the shape of the outline, and I also had an old Easter egg lying around from another project, so I positioned that underneath the wire for a solid base to sculpt on top of. As always, I'm working with Sculpey. That's a pretty standard oil-based clay that you can bake in the oven. The Easter egg support base isn't safe to bake on the other hand, so I made sure to place a layer of aluminum foil in between that and the sculpture so I can separate the two parts later. From there, I covered the entire mask with an even layer of Sculpey and got to work smoothing out all the imperfections. After that, I made the stencil for the eyes and the mouth, both out of paper, and traced the shapes onto the mask. The mouth itself needs to stick outwards from the base, and I also need to make it thick enough to sculpt all the cracks and details of a mask that's supposed to be made out of wood. Even for Nintendo 64 graphics at the time, the Deku Mask had so much emotion and such a sadness about the expression, so I'm going to try my best to sculpt a realistic version of that. Next, I reinforced everything with some extra aluminum wire, then cut out the holes for the eyes. Now, if you're a Zelda fan, definitely check out the video where I created the moon from Majora's Mask. There's a link to that in the description below. Feel free to comment which Zelda project you think I should build next. Once all the basic shapes were in place, it's time to start adding some texture. I looked at a lot of real-life textures in nature, such as tree trunks, wood carvings, as well as tree bark. Now, I went to school in Vancouver, and one of the best things about living on the West Coast are these insanely old trees in these crazy dense forests. I'm using that as inspiration for the features of the mask, twisting the wood texture in different directions to give it as much expression as possible. For the center of the mouth, I made sure to scrape away at the clay, but only in one direction at a time. A real mask made from wood would have a lot more resistance compared to Sculpey. It's a small detail, but I think it's really going to help make this Deku Mask feel a lot more believable. It all took some time, but I really made sure to give the bark a direction for the grain and sculpt in as many of these small little details that I could think of. I also removed a bunch of clay around the edge of the mask, so it looks like it's been eroding and chipping away over time. Just like natural tree bark, I created several imperfections. I rolled up some rings of clay and sculpted them into some knots, twisting through the mask. After that, I made a bunch of these little fractured pieces of bark fragments and attached those asymmetrically near the eyes. At this point, I'm definitely happy with how the sculpt has all come together, so I turned on the oven and let the Sculpey bake for about an hour, which means it's time to start working on the leaves that are growing out of the top of the Deku Mask. For those, I cut out 3 shapes of foam. For objects like these, I don't think Sculpey is the right material, and it's definitely not going to be strong enough, so I'll be using Warbla, which is a thermoplastic bendable material instead. I traced out the shapes of the foam and cut out 2 identical pieces of thermoplastic for each leaf. Following that, I fired up my heat gun, and once the thermoplastic was warm enough to bend into shape, I placed the foam on the inside of the 2 pieces. Fortunately, Warbla is self-adhering and only sticks to itself when it's hot, so I sealed in the foam to give the leaf some extra depth and trimmed off the excess plastic. The only downside is that you do have to keep heating and reheating the plastic, which is a bit of a pain, but the results are totally worth it. I sculpted a few details to make the leaf a little bit more realistic and repeated the process for the other 2 leaves. Now, I had left some wire exposed on the top of the mask before I baked it in the oven. That way, I can anchor the leaves onto the mask and reinforce the adhesion with a bit more plastic onto the back of the leaf. I blended everything together, and once all the elements were cooled down and fully attached, the sculpting process was complete, at least at this point. But that's only half the fun, because now it's time to play around with the color. Honestly, the entire painting process is relatively straightforward. Because tree bark can have so many different shades, I began with a series of watered down acrylic paint. This helps to reach all the indentations and gives varying degrees of color depending on the light. I want the circle in the center of the mouth to look like it's been carved out of wood using a knife, so I left that quite a bit lighter in color compared to the rest of the mask. I'm still thinking that the tree bark looks a little bit too orange here, so I mixed up just a little bit of green to help tone everything down. Once the base coats were dry, I applied a dark brown over the rest of the surface. For the foliage, on the other hand, I used a dark forest green for the base coat, and to give the leaves a bit more contrast, I went back in with a lighter green just for the edges. I also made sure to add a black layer for the indentations. I repeated the process to help everything blend together. Finally, I applied some dry brushing for those extra highlights. This really helps bring out all the details that went into the sculpting process. But speaking of sculpting, there's still one more element that I have to work on, and those are of course the eyes. Obviously, the Deku Mask, it has these absolutely piercing eyes, and it made a lot more sense to build those as separate pieces. As I was working on them, I made sure that the dimensions of the eyes are slightly larger than the eye sockets appear on the mask. That way I can mount them from behind the mask without any visible seams showing through. I also gave them some vertical striations, so it looks like the bark has been stripped off the wood entirely. And once that was complete, I put them in the oven and baked them for 45 minutes. Now, for the color of the eyes, they need to be hyper saturated. So I started off with a bright yellow for the highlights, gradually blended in some orange for the midsection, and red for the lower parts of the shadow. Honestly, I did that entire process a couple of times until I had the color gradient looking just right. Then, I applied a black wash on top, all to add in some extra weathering. Next, I attached the eyes onto the backside of the mask and painted the entire surface black. The entire project was so much fun to work on, but finally, after all of that, this Zelda Deku Mask is complete. All that's left to do is sit back and enjoy the final result.